Firefly is quintessentially American science fiction. It unabashedly wraps itself in the style of a Western, and it's a story about fighting for self-determination against a distant empire. It's a visual and thematic salad of America's self-image. But even more than these celebrated elements, Firefly is perhaps most of all a Civil War and Reconstruction story. At its core, it's about the lost cause, the romanticized idea of the Confederacy crafted after the war of proud and noble people fighting a losing battle against an overwhelming force rolling over their way of life with a tide of soulless mechanization and finance capital. Fighting for the good stuff, not that little slavery thing that was going on. Naturally, this comparison makes some fans a little uncomfortable, and I know some people are already typing angry comments. This isn't me making some Confederate apology. The comparison was in the forefront of the writer's mind as he worked on the story.
And the second book I read is The Killer Angels, which is about the Battle of Gettysburg. And even though Mal wasn't fighting for slavery, I'm happy to say, he is someone who fought at a time when he was just crushed by the opposing force, and it changed him.
So the Browncoats aren't Confederates in the sense of wanting to sit around their porch drinking mint juleps while their slaves toil in the fields. They do, however, share that post-war lost cause narrative, that sense of struggle against implacable forces, of having tried to build a nation and preserve a way of life, and failing.
What were you in the war? That big war you failed to win?
Of having to pick up the pieces of that failure, but refusing to be shamed for it. They're proud people, even in defeat.
There's very little American fiction about the people who won the war, about the North, the people we all like to be identified with. We're all interested in the South because they lost, and we love losers.
For the Confederacy, the story of the lost cause was formed almost immediately after the war. And while it's generally bad history, being more romanticized revisionism than objective reconstructing of the past, it is enormously significant in a cultural sense. Partly it's a refocusing of the Confederacy away from slavery, the underlying cause, instead focusing on second-order factors like states' rights, resisting an overbearing federal government, and protecting a mythical pastoral way of life. But at the same time, it's not entirely revisionist bullshit. Because while slavery was the underlying cause of the war at a macro level, it wasn't the motivating cause for the vast majority of participants. Most of the legislators voting to secede pointed to a long list of grievances stemming from the conflict over slavery, rather than slavery itself. The Union war effort was to preserve the Union, to retain territory, not to abolish slavery. Southern men didn't join the Army to protect the legal right of the planter class to own slaves any more than Northern men enlisted out of a burning passion to free them. While Lincoln did wage a war that ultimately ended in emancipation, it was incidental to the aim of preserving the Union. As he famously wrote in his letter to Horace Greeley, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." The point being that the reasons individuals fight wars and the reasons for the war happening are seldom the same thing. Wars have to be sold to the public. It's a dirty and shameful business, but a well-established one, I'm afraid. But the peace has to be sold too. For the South, the lost cause let them hold their heads high, let them retain honor. They were fighting for liberty, not slavery, not traitors or secessionists, but patriots, just as Washington and Jefferson before. They fought well, but were overwhelmed by the soulless mass production of northern factories, or as one of the architects of the lost cause narrative, Jubal Early, said,
"That seemed right to you."
You knew it was coming. I mean Confederate General Jubal Early, who said that the Confederacy had been gradually worn down by combined agencies of numbers, steam power, railroads, mechanism. You may have heard a similar argument about the Second World War. It's part of the Wehraboo thing. And in both cases, it's partly true, which is why it's good myth-making. But it's framed within a broader narrative to imply that the Confederacy fought well, fought better, and would have whooped the Yankees if not for their money, factories, and blockades. And while the lost cause has long fallen out of favor in academic circles over its heavy historical revisionism, it remains firmly in the culture, in part because it served a very real social function in the decades following the war. Just as it offered Southerners a means of accepting the reality of defeat without having to accept being conquered, It had appeal in the North, partly as a means of putting the war behind us and getting the country back on track. You put up a good fight, Johnny Reb. Let's be brothers again.
War's long done. All just folk now.
The Lost Cause served a vital function in reuniting the country, and it's something that Firefly's verse, only 6 years after the war, could really use.
Independents were a bunch of cowardly, inbred piss pots. Should have been killed off of every world spinning.
By following Mal and his crew, we get this ground-level post-war Lost Cause view of the Unification War. From what we see in the show, we don't really know what the underlying causes were, only that the less industrialized outer planets were defeated. Clearly they weren't fighting to preserve a socioeconomic system predicated on forced labor, but there was probably more to it than just wanting to be independent. Just as was the case with America's war for independence, there were a number of underlying pressures and grievances. While the Declaration of Independence enumerated many of them, there was also the deeper issue of fundamentally different economic interests. For the Crown, the whole point of having colonies is to enrich the home country. But people living in those colonies have other priorities. That's the underlying reason for the many disputes over taxes being levied on the colonies, for example. Maybe Firefly had a similar scenario, with the outer planets being taxed enough to perceptibly impair their own development, or what few manufactured goods they had being uncompetitive for export due to tariffs or simply prohibited. Independence becomes a mechanism for throwing off the taxes, or more likely simply keeping the revenue closer to home with the new government instead of sending it abroad. One element among many, of course. It's not all about taxes. But I, for one, am curious about what macro-level causes led to the browncoats in the war for independence. We know what the frontline soldiers were fighting for, but what were the deeper issues? But not only is Firefly's story an echo of the American Civil War, but even the show itself has a lost cause narrative around it.
The people who made the show and the people who saw the show, which is roughly the same number of people, fell in love with it a little bit. Too much to let it go. Too much to lay down arms when the battle looked pretty much lost.
Firefly was a show loved by its fans, but actively sabotaged by the network. A great series that was robbed of its chance to shine. But the memory lives on, and we even get hopeful talk of sequels and reboots every few years. Firefly will rise again. Well, probably not, but this way we get to remember it not only for what it was, but for what it could have become, while being spared the pain of having to see it take terrible turns and hop over a shark or two on the way. Whether we're talking about a show canceled before its time or a defeat in war, lost cause narratives don't really help us understand what happened. They're bad history. But they can both keep an idea alive or help put it to rest by giving people a way to accept that its time is past. And it's a reminder that in terms of how history affects people's lives in the present, what people believe and how they feel about it has far more impact than what really happened. In the case of Firefly, Fox fumbled it hard, but they didn't give Joss Whedon millions of dollars to make a show so they could actively sabotage it. Why, yes, I am wearing an old gray coat. No, this one's from another country that made extensive use of forced labor. There's probably some angry tankies down in the comments now.